listener production.
Hi, Sasha Barbagat with another episode of The Briefing. The federal government this morning announced the AUKUS partners, that's Australia, the United States and the UK, are considering expanding the group to include Japan. China has already issued a statement to say it is gravely concerned at news AUKUS is considering expanding. The South China Morning Post is quoting the Chinese Foreign Ministry, saying such a move would intensify the arms race in the Indo-Pacific region and disrupt regional peace and stability. So what does it mean for the Asia-Pacific region? And more specifically, what does it mean for Australia? David Andrews is Senior Policy Advisor at the ANU National Security College and he joins me now. David, thanks for being here. Was expanding AUKUS always part of the plan?
Certainly that is the way it has been framed in remarks this morning, but I am not necessarily quite as convinced of that. So I think we all saw that AUKUS emerged quite suddenly into the public eye a couple of years ago when, days before we were thinking we were going to be getting French submarines, and then overnight it turns out that we're actually getting American and then jointly developed nuclear-powered submarines in a whole new arrangement that no one had heard of outside of the Prime Minister's office. So I think it's a bit hard for us to be confident that the way things are shaping out is exactly how they were planned at the outset, because we don't really know what was planned on day one. But there has certainly been, over the course of the last 2 years or so since it entered the public eye, there have been regular suggestions or indications that there's perhaps the chance that other countries could be involved. Canada's been mentioned, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, the sort of either existing allies or close security partners of those three member AUKUS nations within the Indo-Pacific region.
Look, I want to play a little bit from the Prime Minister's press conference earlier today. Let's just have a quick listen to that.
What's proposed is to look at Pillar 2 of AUKUS and look at a project by project whether there would be engagement, and Japan is a natural candidate for that to occur.
So off the back of that, David, can you explain to us what Pillar 2 is?
In short, it's all the non-submarine parts of AUKUS. So understandably, given the revolutionary nature of the technology in a nuclear-powered submarine compared to our current diesel-electric ones and the size of the investment that comes with it, a lot of the focus has been on Pillar 1, on the submarines. That's easy to understand. They're a tangible, defined product that we're acquiring that requires more training, more investment, more construction all throughout Australia to enable that to come online in the next sort of 10 to 15 years. Now, Pillar 2 has operated somewhat under the radar throughout that period as well. It was announced at the same time. It's a whole range of advanced capabilities that could go from cybersecurity to AI, hypersonics, undersea detection technologies as well. So it could encompass, theoretically, almost anything of a joint technological development sense. So I guess when we think about Japanese industry, it has a high slant towards high technology engineering and science and technology. So that's at a pure industrial level. That makes a lot of sense to be talking to Japan. But from a wider strategic standpoint, Japan is one of the, if not the largest, Asian military outside of China. I think they are the 9th largest spenders on defence in the world, which, of course, there are constitutional limitations in Japan as to what their self-defence force can do, but the limits of that have been pushed more and more in response to some of China's actions in the East China Sea and South China Sea. So there's a strategic interest for the AUKUS partners in engaging more with Japan and integrating them into some of these wider arrangements to build closer relations, particularly between, say, Australia and Japan and the UK and Japan, who we don't share formal alliances with Japan like the US does. So it's all part of tightening those linkages and building a more comprehensive network of partners through the region who share similar concerns about China's actions.
You could essentially say AUKUS functions essentially as a bit of a security pact, right? That signatories or countries that are involved kind of are agreeing to help each other when it comes to military and capabilities and technology. Is that fair to say?
I think that's how it's often characterised, but I probably wouldn't take that approach myself, in that there is no formal agreement that underpins AUKUS. There's nothing that anyone signed. There's nothing that is publicly available to set out what the expectations are individually or collectively as a group. So as far as I'm aware, the only written piece of documentation that has been signed is an agreement to allow the transfer of nuclear technology from the US and the UK to Australia to help us develop the workforce to crew the submarines and to maintain them and such. If something were to occur, it's not a stretch to think that those parties might be involved in some way, but AUKUS itself carries no obligations of that nature. And I think that's an important point to make, is that I think people are a little bit concerned or uncertain, perhaps, around what AUKUS is, because we see lots of announcements, we see lots of dollar signs and submarines and technology being discussed, but there's not a clear sense of what sits underneath that.
Why do you think there's been such a strong reaction then from China to this news that AUKUS is purely just considering including Japan in the pact?
Yeah, so I guess the immediate answer is proximity, in that China and Japan are very geographically close, and they have overlapping maritime claims in the East China Sea, the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. There are regular clashes between their coast guards, aircraft flying into each other's territory, or rather flying from China into Japanese territory, that is to say. We could go back, I'm sure, hundreds of years into Japanese and Chinese history that leads up to something as well as the contemporary events. So there's an underlying level of discomfort there. But I would also say that the way in which China has reacted at this stage is consistent with what I would expect. So they've made some strong statements through their foreign ministry. They've consistently been opposed to AUKUS from day one. I guess the question is, what happens next? So are they going to do anything differently? Are they going to take any actions? I would be surprised if they hadn't prepared for this eventuality, but I also would want to caution us from elaborating too much on what this announcement means for Australia and for AUKUS as well, because, as I think you just pointed out, Sasha, that the statement released by the three defence ministers that Prime Minister referred to is around potentially including Japan in specific projects within Pillar 2. So I'm not sure that at this stage we're seeing, say, a full expansion of the AUKUS arrangement in headline terms to now become JAUKUS, as some people call it, Japan, Australia, UK, US. I think it's more they're looking for ways to, if there are specific projects or specific technologies that another country has expertise in or could offer some valuable insights on a case-by-case basis, project by project, whether that's Japan or South Korea or Canada or New Zealand or whomever else it might be.
So much ado about nothing then?
Well, I mean, that is often the case with these sort of announcements, is that they want to sound very grand, but we haven't really seen a lot that's been delivered yet out of AUKUS, and that's part of the challenge, I think, that people in the Australian and international strategic community have consistently raised, is that we're seeing great initiatives announced, we're seeing lots of talk, but until it starts delivering something, it's hard to see how effective it will be as an organisation. So the submarines will take 10, 15, 20 years or more in some cases, and Pillar 2, of course, is developing really cutting-edge, groundbreaking technology. So there will be a long train before you see a lot of actionable projects. But there's a lot of work to get to that stage, which means there's a sort of a long ramp up. The more people you start bringing in, the more variables you have to account for and opinions you have to account for. So I think the challenge is, does AUKUS look to expand now and bring in more partners before that shape becomes too embedded? Or do they focus on getting delivery, getting things sort of getting that production line flowing of capability development and technological investment, and then you find opportunities to bring people in from there? So I get the impression that this is a live conversation within those governments as well, and the fact that we don't have a more sort of foundational document or something that everyone is signing on to and setting out those expectations and parameters beyond these occasional announcements, I think points to some of that uncertainty from what was a very sudden announcement to now a quite expansive institution that covers 7 different kinds of advanced technologies plus submarines in 3 countries and different legislative and political requirements, different standards around the handling of security information. So there's all these different variables that are being played out. And I think the intention of this is probably to indicate that there's interest involving Japan and others and taking the first step along that road. But I get the sense that there'll be a lot more of these sort of slightly more grand-sounding announcements that haven't yet delivered an output, and then in time those outputs will emerge. But I think that's the real pressure point, is start showing people what there is beyond submarines and showing the advantages of this partnership, which would then encourage others possibly to engage rather than sitting back and casting aspersions.
David, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thanks, Sasha.
That was David Andrews, Senior Policy Advisor at the ANU National Security College. That's all we have time for this afternoon. I'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning from 6 with Antoinette Lattouf. Thanks for listening.